Begin transmission. This is a message from the anonymous charity also known as The Collective. Today's broadcast date is January 10, 2019. This is a continuation from our message dated January 9th. The Franklin cover-up and the Mockingbird run MSM. For many, King and Boys Town are synonymous with the scandal involving child sex and drug abuse that officials in Lincoln, Nebraska were able to suppress and effectively cover up. It is among the most blatant of all of the mostly ignored stories in this country that have been buried because they affected a large number of children, many under the age of 10, who were viciously raped by important men, so-called pillars of their communities. The cover-up appears to involve the police and courts in Nebraska and also the FBI. A woman named Carol Stitt, director of the Nebraska Foster Care Review Board, explains in the documentary below, Conspiracy of Silence, that the allegations of children being taken to political parties where they would be abused sexually, usually at after-hour parties, originated with her office. The lives of Alicia Owen, Paul Bonucci, Troy Boner and the other victims of what appears to be a government-orchestrated child rape syndicate, will never be what they could have due to this ridiculous miscarriage of justice. The fact that it happened in the nation's Bible Belt is a sad indicator of the massive hypocrisy that exists between religion and the actions of men. Nebraska Republican Senator Loran Schmidt worked with Stitt and investigators to build the case, and soon they had 5 solid victims whose testimony would work in court to bring the various suspects to justice. Little did he know that powers to be in this seemingly corrupt Midwest state would block every move to bring the case forward, and that even the media would serve as a partner in the crime of cover-up. As it turns out, one of the suspects worked in the upper echelon of a daily newspaper that served as a tool for discrediting victim testimony. Once again we see the workings of Mockingbird-infiltrated media circus. The operation, that was supposedly terminated decades ago, is still very active today in 2019. Q confirms it. So what really transpired back then? Victims who came forward were persecuted. One key witness would testify in mid-stride that he made up his allegations. A female victim who stuck to her story of years of rape and sex abuse at the hands of top officials in Lincoln, Nebraska, was convicted of perjury and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Those close to the case say the perjury conviction was a clear message to all of the victims, that they too would pay dearly if they spoke of their past involvement with the Franklin child prostitution ring. Larry King, who was a rising star in the GOP, was convicted of embezzling over $38 million from Franklin Community Federal Credit Union, FCU, in Omaha, and served 10 years of a 15-year prison sentence. That's right. The victim who spoke was sent to prison for 15 years for perjury, while King received 15 but did only 10 years for crimes involving $38 million and was never convicted in the child prostitution ring, nor were any other officials. These operations overseen by King would be conducted at Republican fundraising after parties, in which young boys and girls were brokered to senators, congressmen and women and persons of influence. All of this is coming back to light in the military hearings. There is no coincidence that POTUS signed the new trafficking bill into legislation only yesterday, January 9th. So connected to the political world was King that upon his parole he was recruited into the National Republican Party. King's strategy, like that of MKUltra, was to target political figures to ensure anonymity and continued financial support from legislature, by using children from Boys Town and others kidnapped to compromise influential men and women. These political figures would be photographed and videotaped engaging in drug-taking and various sexual activity with minors. The sexual abuse of children, as horrific and criminal as it is, was only part of the story. It was the prominent figures in the US government's involvement in the drug trade that made this story so much more explosive. Johnny Gosch was a 12-year-old paperboy in Iowa when he disappeared on September 5, 1982. Paul Bonucci told attorney John DeCamp that he was in a sex ring with Gosch as a teenager and was forced into participating in Gosch's abduction. He also admitted along with Alicia in that they had been used as drug couriers to bring cocaine in from the West Coast for Alan Bayer, Larry King and others during the 1980s. It was first reported by the World Herald reporter James Flannery that King was running guns and money into Nicaragua, and that the CIA was heavily involved. We, the anonymous charity, have already disclosed documents showing this as fact. The story told by Operation Monarch victims, one of whom is Paul Banuxai, is that they were tortured for the purpose of creating multiple personalities within them. These multiple personalities could then be programmed as spies, drug mules, prostitutes, or assassins. With access to thousands of documents that were sealed by 2 grand juries, as well as the sealed testimony of one, we the collective demonstrated that state and federal grand jury processes in Nebraska played an integral role in the cover-up. Instead of indicting the alleged perpetrators, these grand juries indicted the victims who would not recant their accounts of abuse on charges of perjury. In one case, a 21-year-old who had been abused since adolescence was indicted on 8 counts of perjury by both state and federal grand juries. Facing more than 300 years in prison, she still refused to recant. Her travesty of a trial resulted in a prison sentence of 9 to 15 years. She spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. This individual was released from prison in 2000, and she has become a model citizen. She is happily married and gainfully employed. Conversely, one of the ring's pedophilic pimps, who was not charged with a single count of child abuse, moved halfway across the country. By 2009, he had enmeshed himself among a new brood of economically disadvantaged children. The fact that the girl was convicted and given an extremely long sentence makes little sense when compared to this paragraph from a Mockingbird New York Times article from the 18th of December 1988. The Omaha office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation acknowledged that it had independently received reports of sexual abuse and that they were a subject of its own criminal inquiry into the credit union affair. And the Office of the Nebraska Attorney General said it had directed the state police also to investigate the reports. Then the New York Times, still following the story, wrote on the 25th of December 1988. A state file containing reports of physical and sexual abuse of foster children, based on interviews with some of the children and including one instance reminiscent of slave auctions, has been turned over to the Executive Board of the Nebraska Legislature. People familiar with the file's contents describe it as a voluminous compilation of reports acquired over the last 2 years by the State Foster Care Review Board from a variety of child care professionals, including school teachers and social workers. However, by the 29th of July 1990, the New York Times changed their tune, falling in line with Nebraska Press, with an article titled, "Omaha Grand Jury Sees Hoax in Lurid Tales." Lurid reports of child sex abuse, drug trafficking, pornography and political intrigue that have held Omaha enthralled for nearly 2 years were a carefully crafted hoax, a county grand jury in Nebraska has concluded. Perhaps not too surprising that the agency both Judith Miller and Jason Blair both called home, was willing to jump on the bandwagon instead of questioning the sincerity of this Midwestern disease. Even though the FBI and local authorities acknowledge that they knew about the child sex abuse, Nebraska still convicted Alicia Owen for reporting the abuse, convicting her of several counts of perjury. What a disservice to all crime victims, particularly rape and sex abuse survivors. Nebraska's system of injustice truly is. The crimes of Larry King and his criminal cohorts are outstanding today, and it is important that the criminals, regardless of who they are, not abscond forever. So why have you never heard of the Franklin cover-up? Operation Mockingbird. That's why. You may not have heard of the Franklin cover-up, but you most certainly will soon. Evidence dating back to these events are being looked at again, as POTUS administration reopens multiple cases from the Bush and Clinton era. Conspiracy of silence is a powerful, disturbing documentary revealing a nationwide child abuse and pedophilia ring that leads to the highest levels of government. Featuring intrepid investigator John DeCamp, a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran and 16-year Nebraska state senator, Conspiracy of Silence reveals how rogue elements at all levels of government have been involved in systematic child abuse and pedophilia to feed the base desires of key politicians. Based on the riveting book, The Franklin Cover-Up, Conspiracy of Silence begins with the shutdown of Nebraska's Franklin Community Federal Credit Union after a raid by federal agencies in November 1988 revealed that $40 million was missing. When the Nebraska legislature launched a probe into the affair, what initially looked like a financial swindle soon exploded into a startling tale of drugs, money laundering, and a nationwide child abuse ring. 19 months later, the Legislative Committee's chief investigator died suddenly and violently, like more than a dozen other people linked to the Franklin case. So why have you never heard of the Franklin cover-up? Originally scheduled to air in May of 1994 on the Discovery Channel, Conspiracy of Silence was yanked at the last minute due to formidable pressure applied by top politicians. Some very powerful people did not want you to watch this documentary. We now know who they were. A lot of them are still alive today and will face justice. A copy of this videotape was furnished anonymously to former Nebraska State Senator and Attorney John DeCamp, who made it available to retired FBI agent Ted L. Gunderson. While the video quality is not top grade, this tape is a blockbuster in what is revealed by the participants involved. Note: this film had to be reassembled from remaining VHS fragments after an all-out effort was made to block the film's release and destroy all extant copies. Every effort has been made to restore it to the original and complete meant-to-be broadcast version. The documentary is on our backup channel in the link below. We will link all this to the HRC Ron Alice and Wonderland story on January 11, 2019 at 17:45 Pacific Time. This has been a message from the anonymous charity known as The Collective. Today's broadcast date is January 10, 2019. End of transmission.